Um, the Thessalonians, there are two epistles. Epistles are also known as letters, written by the Apostle Paul. Obviously, we don't have enough time to go through every single chapter and every single verse. So I'm just going to highlight a few key passages, but then absolutely encourage you to go back and read on your own. It is a fascinating book. When I say book, I mean combined 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. But there are a lot of distinct features that you don't find in some of the other epistles. I think it'll be helpful for you to understand some of the ways that Christianity differs from other religions when it comes to subjects like death, or how do Christians think about suffering? Why do Christians think that Jesus is coming back? So 1st and 2nd Thessalonians is actually a great book to address concepts like those. As always, it's helpful to begin with the historical setting of the epistles. It gives us an appreciation for what was happening at the time the epistles were written, what was the geographical, cultural setting, what were the challenges that the city was facing, the believers were facing, that made it necessary for Paul to write them these letters. So let's begin with a brief introduction. As I said earlier, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians were written approximately in 51 AD by the Apostle Paul. He wrote it not when he was in Thessalonica, but he writes it from a city called Corinth that he goes to a few years after his visit to Thessalonica, during which time he founds a church in Thessalonica. Paul was born in 5 AD, it is believed. He came to know Christ when he was 31 years old. That was in 36 AD. We know that because we are able to backdate it from the time of the Jerusalem Council, which happened in 50 AD. That happens 14 years after. So 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, both epistles or letters, were written to believers in Thessalonica. We learn a little bit more about the city itself. 2nd Thessalonians were written maybe a year later in AD 52, shortly after Paul wrote the first letter. There are a lot of common themes. The church was founded during Paul's second missionary journey. All in all, I think we know that Paul undertook 3 missionary journeys. Now, Paul had to leave the city of Thessalonica sooner than he would have liked because there were riots and opposition to his message. So because of that hostility, he had to leave Thessalonica. Now, Paul at this time, unlike the other letters that we reviewed the last time, remember Galatians, Ephesians, were written when Paul was imprisoned, not the letter to the Thessalonians. Paul was not yet imprisoned. That is going to happen for the first time 8 years later in AD 59. He's going to be imprisoned by Rome, where he actually has a very productive time writing letters to the various churches he has founded. But not this particular letter, which, as I said earlier, Paul wrote when he was in the city of Corinth. I like this chart. It shows the timeline of Paul's ministry. I have borrowed this and I have credited the creator, the Berean Bible Society, here. If you look at the box here, this is when Paul undertook his second apostolic journey, or his second missionary journey, as it is commonly known. He covers Galatia, Macedonia, Greece, Asia Minor, and the city of Thessalonica is in the province of Macedonia. But when does he write 1st and 2nd Thessalonians? Look at the arrow here. This is in AD 51, AD 52, if 2nd Thessalonians was written a year later. So this chart helps us to situate the time at which Paul wrote the letter to the believers in Thessalonica. What was happening in the city of Thessalonica? Paul We won't be able to cover all of it in this lesson, but Paul is using language to defend himself. There is a lot of defensive language. And that's because, Paul was a traveling philosopher. So he was being accused by some of these false teachers who had infiltrated the church with their false message. And they were accusing Paul of being in it for financial motives. They were accusing him of being greedy, of having base motives, and of being deceitful. So Paul is using strong language to defend himself against these false apostles, especially because it's not so much about his personal defense. It's not so much his character that he's afraid is being maligned, but he wants to make sure that the message is not being brought into disrepute. So because Paul is a traveling messenger, a traveling preacher, it's possible that, that lifestyle might have opened him up to criticism because he's going from city to city and being supported by people or believers who have come to know Christ in those cities. But, Paul is not financially dependent on anybody else, although he accepts and, acknowledges the generosity of the churches, but he is also a tent maker himself, able to sustain his travels because of the work of his own hands. And you will see that that's an interesting topic that Paul will cover. He encourages the believers to work with their own hands. Apparently, this was a bit of a problem for the church in Thessalonica. Generally they like to, the Greeks are known for philosophy, right? All of us know that, Greek mythology and philosophy is very, very prominent even in our days today. There is a lot of influence. But the Romans were also deeply influenced by the Greek way of life and thinking. So a lot of ideas were discussed, but working with their hands and laboring themselves was, not so much in vogue. So Paul had to set apart some of their wrong thinking and encourage believers to work hard and work with their own hands. Now, as I said earlier, there was this issue of the false gospel and confusion arising in the church that Paul had founded. Remember, now Paul is writing this several years later. Not too many years later, but he is in another city. So he's writing a letter and sending it through his companions to this church. And he's hearing issues that, there is some confusion in the church. This is a common way that Satan operates, and Paul makes it clear in some of his other letters too. The sowing of confusion. And it sounds convincing, right? What makes a false gospel believable
listening to the narrow path
is that it does have partial truths. It does have half-truths, which is why it can sometimes be difficult to separate, truth from error, which is why you have to be super alert. Just because it sounds sort of true or close to the truth does not mean that it's actually true. So Paul wants believers to be wise and discerning. Now in Thessalonica, because this is Greek culture, there were a lot of different gods. Gods for, different kinds of elements. Separate gods for everything. There was a god of war, Ares, god of love, Eros, earth, Gaia, sea, Poseidon, pleasure, Hedone, anger, Elissa, heaven, Uranus, and hell, Hades. Paul is, bringing his message of the one true God in this culture. Imagine how jarring it would have been, right? These are people who are used to thinking of having a different God for a different occasion. And now here comes a man who is reasoning from the Jewish scriptures and talking about Jesus Christ, who died and then was resurrected and is, was sent by God the Father, is one with God the Father, it would have been, somewhat of a disturbing message to the Gentiles, to the Greeks who lived in the city. So the city was actually a very prominent city. Today, Thessaloniki is an important city in modern day Greece. It's actually a fairly large city. I mean, definitely by Canadian standards. A large Canadian city is maybe 500,000, and this is actually a larger city. Today it has a million residents. So it's a sizable city. Thessalonica was made the capital city of the Roman province of Macedonia. That was in 146 BC. And like I said earlier, it was a prominent city because of its location. Location is everything, right? And Thessalonica happened to be at the intersection of two major roads. One is Via Ignatia. You've heard of this road. I had mentioned it earlier as well. Today, it still exists. It's actually a multi-lane highway. But the Ignatia Way, or Via Ignatia, it led eastward from Italy, and then the other road connected the Danube to the Aegean Sea. So because the city of Thessalonica lay at the intersection, it was, very strategic in its location. It was a major port, it was a trading center, and it was second in prominence only to Corinth. If you remember, we did a study of 1st and 2nd Corinthians a while ago. So Corinth was also a very prominent city. You're looking at a picture of modern day Thessaloniki, by the way. This is not during Paul's times. This is what it looks like today. Now, despite its prominence and its importance in biblical history, not much has been excavated, and that's understandable because the ancient city is actually underneath the modern city. So obviously there would have to be a lot of disruption because the city sits on top of the ancient ruins. Having said that, there are some ruins that are still viewable, accessible to tourists. So how did Paul find himself in Thessalonica? Look at this map here. It charts Paul's course on his second missionary journey. Paul was with his companions, Silas and Timothy, and they came to Thessalonica from Philippi. You might remember we did a study of the book of Philippians. Now both cities are in Macedonia. Do you see in the map here? On the left is the province of Macedonia, and this is where Thessalonica is. So from Philippi is a city where Paul and Silas were arrested, they were thrown in jail, and they share the way to salvation with the jailer, who converts to belief in Christ, and they leave Philippi and come to Thessalonica. When he comes to Thessalonica, he preaches in the main synagogue of that entire region for 3 weeks. He is using the Jewish scriptures. Remember, Paul is a rabbi. He's a Pharisee. He's well versed in the Jewish scriptures. He is using the scriptures that was available to his people, the Jewish people, and he is reasoning and explaining to them why Jesus is a long-awaited Messiah. That Jesus had to come to the earth, he had to suffer, and after his suffering, he had to rise from the dead. Now the reaction to his message was mixed. There were some Jews who were convinced. There were a large number of God-fearing Greeks who responded to Paul's message. There were prominent women as well. Because of that strong response, he established a church in Thessalonica. Now it had Jews, but it was heavily Gentile, predominantly Gentile. Not surprising because it was in Macedonia, the Roman province, far, far away from Jerusalem, which was the center of Jewish life and population. Now, what happens when he's in Thessalonica? What was his time there like? Now, when he was in Thessalonica, he preaches for 3 weeks straight. But there were troublemakers. Some Jews, they started a riot. Paul was staying in the home of a believer. His name was Jason. So, they drag Jason before the Roman magistrates. And you're looking at a picture here of, one of these theaters at Thessalonica. These are ruins. We don't know this was where, Jason was dragged before the Roman magistrates, but it could have been something like this. So because of that opposition, Paul and Silas were sent away to another city, to Berea, by the believers in Thessalonica because they were afraid for Paul's life. So he flees under the cover of night. Now when he comes to Berea, what does Paul do? As was his custom, he preaches in the synagogue in Berea. And again, there is a positive response to the message in the city of Berea. But what happens in Berea? Some of the Jews who had created trouble for Paul in Thessalonica follow him to Berea. And they stirred up trouble for him there. So again, the believers had to arrange for an escape for Paul. And they bring him to Athens. Athens is another prominent city. So from Athens, he goes to Corinth, and he stays in Corinth for 1.5 years, and that is where he writes the letters to the church in Thessalonica, to the believers in Thessalonica. So that is a brief background